Thank you very much. And again, it's good to be the sponsor for this workshop because I get to get the podium to talk for a few minutes, Kaveh, right? You know, you have to do that. Actually, what I wanted to do, just do a quick recap of what you heard this morning. As we were talking about the workshop, and as I mentioned, Kaveh and I were talking about the body area networks and its application and the state of technology and so on, it quickly became obvious, of course, there are lots of communities, organizations investing funding and resources into doing R&D in this area, but it would be nice to bring a sample of the practitioners, product developers, and research organizations to get a sense as to what everybody is doing and maybe establish or try to come up with a roadmap as far as where this technology is going. I think everybody agrees that this is an area that's just exploding. It's becoming part of every activity that you see today, from the little smartphones all the way to wireless health. And it's just crying to, for maybe even establishing a center of excellence where, in my opinion, where this is, I think, the first step to get everybody together and think about a center of excellence where this could be done on a periodic basis, not just for having people over, but turning it into something much bigger and identifying technology gaps, promoting research in this area, and in fact, as part of that, influencing the funding organizations to put more funding towards research in body area networks. With that in mind, I think this first workshop, the idea was to get an eclectic group of people here. This morning you heard about what everybody is looking at as far as body area networks. Our keynote speaker, John Hines from NASA Ames, painted a very, very interesting picture. And even though he came at it from a NASA-centric point of view, quickly you can realize that what he is talking about, and some of the concepts and pieces that he mentioned, are not just specific to NASA. They have applications across so many different areas. And you also heard through the panel discussions, everybody is looking at an aspect of this. Some of the biggest topic areas that we discussed this morning, regulatory stuff, standards. And that kind of brings us to our luncheon speaker, Dr. Bill Heetderks. And Bill is from NIH, and he is from the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering. And also, I guess this morning you did hear from the medical community and from the technology community. I think Bill's talk is going to be very interesting, coming at it from NIH and offering his thoughts and the programs, the focus areas that NIH is looking at. And I'm pretty sure you'll see how that dovetails and crosses across the body area network technology. So without further ado, let me introduce Bill.
Thank you. And security, of course, is a huge issue in many medical systems. It's also an issue with government computers. And I was going to say it may take me 15 minutes to turn my computer back on, but it looks like it's going to do better than that. Okay, so it's a pleasure for me to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk. Before I really get into this talk, I want to just say a little bit about NIBIB, because for those of you that don't know about it, this is part of the NIH. We're 27 institutes and centers, and historically, most of those institutes have been what are called categorical institutes. I was in the Neurology Institute, which is like the brain, and there's heart, lung, and blood, and there's cancer, all aimed at diseases. And NIBIB is biomedical imaging and bioengineering. The bioengineering really sort of says what we are at the NIH is the Technology Institute. So that's where this talk is coming from. And the title that I picked here is The Opportunities for Patient-Centered Healthcare. I think this is very much similar and very tied to wireless, and you'll see why I picked this title. So I'm going to just try and say a few things. Really, first of all, as we've heard this morning, where is this field? Is it a nascent field? Is it a field that's ready to explode or what have you? And then just go through some of the technologies that we're supporting and biological problems that people are looking at, and then just kind of close with a couple of comments. But to sort of pick on this first issue of where exactly are we? And we're talking about radio here, so I thought it was worthwhile going back to Maxwell. And this is one of the, this is basically Maxwell's paper where he talks about Maxwell's equations, which in this case is 20 equations. And I just want you to see one thing, because in fact it really is at the heart of what we're talking about here today. And it's just saying that he's been looking at these phenomena of electrical and magnetic experiments in which bodies in certain states set each other in motion while still at a sensible distance from each other. And that's really what we're talking about here. I mean, these things, they're really setting things in motion, except you do it very small motions and you do it very fast, and suddenly we're talking about communication. So this paper then goes on to develop Maxwell's equations. It's really elegant. It was done back in 1864, and it's certainly a foundation, but we're beyond that. And I think what I would really like to put forward for where this field is today is much more using the model of Marconi. So just to say a little bit about what Marconi was doing. So now we're back to like and it's interesting to look at this history. But 1894 or so, he's tinkering a little bit with making sparks and sending some transmissions. 1896, he moves to England and makes some important friends there. And in 1897, he has obtained a patent. And in 1897, he's also built this little radio that is being used for the Prince of Wales, who's out on his yacht, to be able to keep track of what's happening with the Prince of Wales. So he's actually using it for he's using radio, he's using it as a communication system. If you go back or go forward another 10 years or so, we're talking about the Titanic, and Marconi radio is in existence. The Titanic sinks, and it's actually the Marconi radio that allows the communication that the Titanic is sinking and everything. But the interesting thing about this is, and it's why I've got the topic telegraph system. It's not just the Marconi radio that's used, but it's Marconi operators back in England. It's Marconi operators actually on the Titanic. It's not that Titanic bought a radio. It's actually his operators, and he actually built a system. So it wasn't just the radio. It was the radio, the people, and a closed system. And that's really, I think, where we are with these wireless systems today, where what I think it makes sense to talk about are systems that deliver specific health technologies. So I'll come back to that in terms of my conclusions, because it leads to all sorts of problems when we try to be cooperative. If everybody's building a system to do something specific, how do you cooperate? But I'll save that for the end. So I also think of this in terms of patient-centered healthcare. So here's my wife, and if she needs some help, diagnostic information, she goes to a clinic, sees what's happening there. Her records are stored at the clinic, or they're stored in the hospital, or what have you. And this is sort of the old model. What I'm kind of picturing in the future, so this is our granddaughter, what is her health care going to look like? And hopefully it will be her health care, rather than being in the clinic, everything is going to be this little cloud that kind of follows around behind her. Now, this is a mixed metaphor here, because cloud, you think of this information system, and they've really claimed that word. The cloud that I'm thinking of here is, if you read Peanuts, they had a character, Pigpen, who always had this black cloud behind him. That's what this is. So that the idea is that in the future, wherever you go, your medical information is just kind of this black or white cloud if you're healthy, but this cloud that kind of follows around behind you. And if that happens, all of the kinds of wireless integrated systems and everything else can tie into this medical information system. So really, okay, so switching gears now a little bit to talk about, what are some of the technologies and then some of the applications. So first of all, what are some of the technologies that, we've been supporting or we've been involved with at the NIH and in particular NIBIB. And this is a picture of Tesla. I thought if I talk about Marconi, for those of you, the Serbs in the audience, I better mention Tesla also, who really gets credit for radio. So just a couple of, actually several quick examples of sort of underlying technologies. One is diagnostic technologies that could feed this system, that could feed this information system. And this is an example of a system being designed to detect infections in blood quickly. So the idea is, right now, and this is a problem much larger in women than men typically, but urinary tract infection is a common problem. Now you go to your doctor, he examines you, takes a urine sample, it grows a culture over a couple of days, probably will start you on some antibiotics and then call you back in 2 days. So could this be moved to Walgreens, for example, or to your home, and could you make that diagnostic much more quickly? So this is a system that is aimed at a low-cost chip. That's this guy here that detects the common bacterial infections through a electrochemical signal, and if you do all that, out comes a signal that lets you identify a particular pathogen, and you can move. So this is just a foundational kind of technology. Here's another example of foundational technology that's going to allow us to, if you will, move away from the hospital. This is an example that's work being done at Caltech, where they're developing a low-cost microscope. So currently, if you want to look at cells, you'd look at them using a fairly expensive microscope in the pathology office. Can you move that to something that can be integrated into a chip, so that with microfluidics? And I realize I'm not really going to have the time to go through the details, but it basically uses, photodetectors, CCD kind of detectors, pinholes, and by being very clever about the microfluidics, you slide the cells that you're trying to image across this array of detectors and generate an image. Gas chromatography is another. So this is sort of the current laboratory work. There's a center at the University of Michigan that has been looking at taking these gas chromographs and making them much smaller, much more compact. And again, I'm talking about, okay, these are the building blocks that would eventually go into this. So my rule of thumb, and this is coming from a physics training, if you change something by an order of magnitude, you've got something that's fundamentally different, fundamentally new. And what they're talking about here is not changing something by 1, but by 2 orders of magnitude. So this is in silicon, a little glass chromatograph, which then turns into a finished product, which then one could imagine being part of an integrated system. We're no longer have to worry about the gas chromatograph in the hospital or wherever, but this could actually be something that you're wearing. Some other technology, this is also coming out of the Michigan, looking at low power. So, batteries were mentioned earlier as a problem. If one is developing just a broad network of devices, coming up with low power schemes is important. And the Phoenix, I don't know why they called it the Phoenix, but they developed a processor here that has 30 picowatts of sleep power, and the processing is 2.8 picojoules per instruction. So basically, super low power kinds of processing, very low power radio kinds of things that are being developed, again aimed at low power applications, low power and also low cost, because all of this stuff is aimed at fabrication. I worked with well, let me say it this way. I mean, conceptually, my picture, the way I picture these things happening is, if these systems are going to be widely deployed and made low cost, I mean, you want to think of them as jelly beans as opposed to chromatographs. I mean, developing things that you can make so cheaply that you know, they're almost disposable. There's also some packaging that's low cost, but hermetic packaging that's being developed, which for implantable systems will be extremely valuable. So these are just some examples. Here's an example, another example where we're talking about developing systems to record from the brain. So the picture here is putting electrodes into a brain and then having telemetry and signal processing on the surface of the brain and a telemetry to get signals out of the brain. So these are just kinds of some of the examples of where there's active research going on and some of the potential applications where wireless is going to become important, and I'll be talking about applications in just a minute. But so these are I just wanted to give you sort of a broad picture, first of all, of some of the technologies, for example, that one would be looking at. But the technologies by themselves are of no use unless there are applications. So I just want to highlight a few applications as well of some of this technology. And these are really just samples of some of the things that we're doing. And you know, to be sure, you know, you could imagine some of these technologies, and then the tools that you do to build have to be up to it. And the first part of my talk was to sort of make the case that the tools are really there. It's not like back in the 20s. So there are these proliferation of devices. Just some examples where clinical applications that potentially are useful. So one is and this is an example, but I'm really using this example to focus on the problem, which is monitoring diet and electrolyte intake in end-stage renal disease. So end-stage renal disease, people on dialysis, that's about 200,000 people in the country, and these people, these individuals need to monitor their intake of salt and water and potassium and other things. And so just, you know, a very simple-minded system, in the one case that you're punching things into a tracking system and communicating with the hospital, but if you could automate these, you know, so much the better. But so this is one kind of an example where there is a real need in the community for basically tracking I&O for a broad spectrum of things. This is done in the hospital all the time as well for patients, tracking their input and output, and having a way to automate that is an example. Another example that's tied to I&O is the need for an artificial pancreas. And you know, this artificial pancreas has been a project that is part of the FDA critical path. We've been on a team for that. There are several, you know, commercial companies that are at least looking at it, but conceptually you need a sensor to be able to sense the glucose. You need a control algorithm based on sensing the glucose, apply insulin or insulin and other agents through a pump, and the goal is to close the loop. I think the state of the art at this point in time is that, well, in Europe, they're at least doing something called low glucose suspend, so that if you have the sensor and the sensor says, hey, you're becoming hypoglycemic, it'll turn off the insulin pump. We're really not at the point, we're at the point in this country where the FDA is looking at what it would like in the way of regulation for that. But you know, this is clearly a great need for a system, and you know, it's an example. Hypertension management is another. You know, going back to 15 years ago or 10 years ago, or maybe last week, you went to the doctor's office to find out if you were hypertensive, and they measured your pressure. Can you do it at home? That's this little system here, and eventually can you do it with an implanted system? It was mentioned this morning that there is a an implanted system now that's actually just gone through clinical trial for measuring the right arterial pressure for individuals with congestive heart failure, which is turning out to be a real boom for, managing those patients, managing their fluid. So, this is another example. Here's another kind of example, which is a different kind of problem, but again aimed at a body network, which is a directional hearing aid. So, the basic issue is, and this one, the reason I put this one up is because I care about this one, because if you'll see me sometimes acting like this, it's because I'm not hearing that well. And so can you solve the whole hearing problem? Okay, not necessarily, because, okay, you'd like to say, well, what do you need a hearing aid for? Well, just to amplify. Well, if only it was that simple, if it was just that my eardrum, but in fact I've lost a lot of hair cells, and if it was only that simple, the transducers in the ear, if it was only that simple, but in fact not only have I lost a lot of that, but I've probably lost a lot of brain processing somewhere throughout. So that even if you have, starting with amplification, that's not sufficient to give you good, hearing. That's why hearing aids tend not to work very well. But one can do, make beam-forming antennas for hearing, so that at least, it's not going to solve all problems. But for example, in a situation like this where you're talking around a table, that you could look at someone and actually hear them. To make that work, though, requires multiple microphones, a couple of microphones, and it requires fairly advanced signal processing and communication between the two ears. You can't have independent systems. So it's an example where wireless would be needed. Cochlear prosthesis is sort of one step further along those lines, where wireless body networks, and there's some advanced work going on in this. Monitoring movement disorders, just and again to kind of give you a sense of what some of the problems are. So this is an individual with Parkinson's disease, and okay, so there are both drugs for Parkinson's disease, and there's a procedure called deep brain stimulation. But just to give you a sense of when the drugs are working, so this is a video showing that this individual with Parkinson's. And he's been asked, and the audio is turned off, but he's asked to walk and turn around and walk back, and looks pretty good. That's when the medication is working. This is a picture of the same individual when the medication is no longer working well. And just so you know, for Parkinson's disease, it's very tricky to get the medication just right. So he. So the way that the medication, okay, so they talk about patients with an on-state and off-state, depending on with the medication, and you can say, when you see the patient, look at how wonderful this drug is on Parkinson's disease. One of the things they don't tell you maybe is that that's only for 2 hours a day when the therapy is just right. And if you overdose, you have another set of problems. So are there better ways of kind of making judgments about this? There are also potentially better treatments with deep brain stimulation. But this is an example of monitoring the patient, in the home environment to potentially adjust medication. So sensors that sense acceleration and in EMG activities, and this kind of information can then be monitored, go through an artificial neural network and decision support, et cetera, to develop a system that then feeds back to the physician to allow him to better plan the therapy. And as you could see from the initial videos, it shouldn't be hard to tell when you're in a non-state or an off-state. But in fact, the way it usually is done is with the diary or something like that. You don't get this data. So another area that of wireless technology that's of great interest is the clinical environment. So I mean, this was really sent home to me that when my 96-year-old mother was in the hospital, and you walk down the hall in the hospital, and beep, 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 beep. It's like you've got all these alarms, and they're all functioning independently. And in the intensive care unit, it's an even bigger issue. So I don't know, someone was talking about having everything instrumented to it, everything tied to a bed and all tied. But developing a communication system for patients when they're in the hospital that's, that basically is around the patient, where all of the pumps, the respirator, if you're in an ICU, the respirator, the pulse oximeter, these things are all able to talk with each other and communicate is a problem. And it's one that we've got a project working on it. One of the issues with this actually is figuring out what clinical problem exactly do we want to solve. And there are a number of clinical problems, but to be honest with you, we haven't really hit on the problem in the intensive care unit or wherever that we're going to solve by integrating these yet. And I think that's going to be important to do. Just give another example, network neural prosthesis. So this is a program where one is building devices to restore function in spinal cord injured individuals. And so this is a technology that we've supported for years and years. It's starting 30 years ago and slowly going forward. But it started out with external wires and wires going through the skin to stimulate. Then it went to sort of a dedicated system of for one problem, that is spinal cord injury, restoring function in the upper extremity, one structured solution. And this is an approach where there would be a networked solution that would have sort of a core communication, core elements that could be mixed and matched and configured in a general system to address a number of clinical problems. So these are the building blocks that are being developed, and here are some examples of targeted applications where conceptually you have one networked system that you mix and match to address things ranging from upper extremity paralysis to lower extremity paralysis. So just trying to give you a overall sense of what some of the applications that people are looking at, and that was sort of my quick survey. I'm trying to move this along, and then just really to have a couple of closing comments. This is really my last slide, to say a little bit about where I think we're going and what I see happening in this area. And so there's a huge amount of activity. Industry is clearly very active in this area. We had a meeting back in January or so with Intel, and they're very interested in the home monitoring of individuals, and they want to look at 10,000 homes being monitored. I'll say it was a very, that meeting brings up a philosophical difference. And one of the issues that really got raised in that meeting was there were sort of two camps, and one camp sort of says, build it and they will come, so we'll just start monitoring stuff, and it's going to turn out that this is going to be very valuable information. And I think that's probably right, but that the FDA doesn't like to hear that. Actually, we don't like to hear that. We like to hear. The other camp is identify a problem and demonstrate that you're going to be able to solve this problem. And people who like Bayesian statistics and worry about prior probabilities tend to like this idea of problem. But the industry is very active. We've heard that this morning already. Government is active. We certainly are becoming much more active in this area. We also recently, within this past year, started an informal work group with CMS and FDA and NIST and several other federal agencies to just talk about wireless, and academia is clearly gearing up. So this area, and I'm just talking to the choir here. I think everybody appreciates that this is an area that is of growing interest. And my theme really is that the next step is systems. I really think we're beyond the developing the pieces, ready to move to developing systems, a la Marconi. And, in that context, these things are going to happen. I'm convinced of that. And depending on how much collaboration there is or isn't, these kinds of things are still going to happen. But to me, the great value of developing some collaborative kinds of activities is that the degree to which these things are all going to integrate with each other is, so something is going to happen, but there are multiple, just saying this is going to happen doesn't get us to the end. There are multiple futures out there, so to speak, in terms of how effective this kind of wireless technology is going to be to improve people's welfare, to improve the healthcare. And I think the more these systems are able to communicate with each other, and the more there are, if you will, open standards that everyone is using, the brighter the future is going to be. Now to me, there's a paradox here, because when I talk about Marconi, the reason Marconi was so successful is because he built this little closed system, and from soup to nuts, from beginning to end, it was his system, and the truth is that that's a great way to build a system, especially if you want a reliable system, is to just control everything and keep everything within. So there's this basic conflict between that notion and this notion of having things open. So I think that is sort of a philosophical or what have you, but a fundamental problem that people have to work toward. Identifying pre-competitive areas for work is critical. And this is kind of, so I'm basing this comment to some extent. Our institute is imaging as well as bioengineering, and if you look at the imaging world, the imaging community, the GE, the Siemens, the Philips, the Toshiba, they tended to build their own systems. And they were proprietary systems, and they didn't talk with each other at all. They're sort of realizing now we can still differentiate our systems with having a much more common platform. And as one of the areas that we're focusing on the imaging is on quantitative imaging, where you're measuring something, you get the same answer whether you're using Philips equipment or GE's equipment, and coming up with this idea that there's pre-competitive work that basically, to pick on St. Jude's and Medtronic for no particular reason, but that everybody can work on together, and you can still, make your money in this other competitive area, but identifying a pre-competitive foundation is really critical, and figuring out exactly what that is, I think, is important. And then my last thought, which I think I don't expect any disagreement with, is that the needs and opportunities in this area are really substantial. I think that this, in combination with the events that are happening with respect to electronic health records and a number of other things, are really going to change healthcare in the next 50 years. So that's my comments, and so thank you very much.
Great talk. I know you said we get back in about 10 minutes to, can I steal 2 minutes at least to offer the audience maybe a few questions here and there? Any questions, comments?
Thank you. The processor you presented, which runs at 30 picowatts, could you elaborate on that, whether that microprocessor is in production or not? Thank you.
So the answer is no, and that's the standby power. That is a processor that, okay, there was, and again, talking about government, there was it's called WIMS, which was a National Science Foundation Engineering Research Center on wireless integrated microsystems. And that's a processor that was developed in the context of that WIMS at the University of Michigan. And it has been made, but it absolutely is, it's a university system. It's definitely not in production. Yes?
patient population as opposed to, for example, cardiac monitors or pacemakers that can be commercially very successful versus those kind of niche areas? Could you comment on that?
Yes. So this is always this is a conflict that any organization runs into. I mean, number one, you want to have impact, and if you want to have impact, you identify those diseases that are affecting the greatest number of people. And so that says, you know, cardiac and neural, and you want to do stroke and heart attack and cancer and things like that. The other is then you don't want to leave everybody else behind. So the situation is we definitely, for our general funding, consider prevalence in terms of making assessments of the significance of a condition. There also is a whole organization, and we participate in that, called the Orphan Products Center at the NIH that has special programs that are aimed at these underrepresented conditions. And so there definitely is money set aside specifically for those kinds of conditions. That orphan products, there's a lot happening at NIH. There's a new center of translational medicine being created called NCATS, which is the National Center for something or other. It's translational medicine. The orphan products group is going to be rolled into that. So there's definitely a strong activity in there for if you will, what are sort of known as the orphan products. But you know, we also want to make sure that we address things that are important, and to the more people, the better.